All right. It appears that we are live. Good morning, everybody, and happy Moundville Monday. Welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Lindsay Gordon, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for Moundville Archaeological Park. And today we're joined by Dr. Ian Thompson, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Thompson.
It's an honor to be here.
So while we're broadcasting, feel free to ask us any questions in the comments. And as a reminder, this is live, so anything can happen. So hang in there with us just in case we might have some issues. So today we're going to talk about, what are we going to talk about today, Dr. Thompson?
We're going to talk about Choctaw traditional arts and how they link up with the archaeological record of Alabama.
Awesome. So how should we get started in that conversation?
Well, I'm going to start. If it's all right, I'll introduce myself in the Choctaw language, so viewers can hear what that sounds like. Halito, Chahta Imanopa, Hlimimpachi, Okchamali. So Hochchefo Ian Thompson, Chahta Machin Naholosia, Independence, Missouri, Amathpoato, Kia Himak Nitok, Sitikchiami, Iltik Toklo Cut, Antlers, Oklahoma, Belinka Lashwa, Atoko, Oklahoma, Chahta Okla, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Toksalale. Himak Nitok, Chahta, Impunna, Hachimanoplachi, Hashaolaka, Hashiokoke Lihoki. Hello, everyone. I greet you in the beautiful Choctaw language. My name's Ian Thompson. I'm Choctaw and Euro-American. I was born in Independence, Missouri, but now I reside with my wife, Amy, near Antlers, Oklahoma, and I serve as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for Choctaw Nation. Today, I'm going to talk with you guys about Choctaw traditional arts, and I'd like to thank you all for joining me. So to get started, I put this presentation together, and it's a fun presentation. It's got lots of images, things to help us get outside the room that we're currently in with the lockdown. And it looks at three different types of early Choctaw traditional arts and how they connect with the archaeological record at places like Moundville and how they're made and how they're still part of the community today. So if we're ready, I'll go ahead and get started.
Yes, I'm super excited.
All right. You notice that the titles are in Choctaw and the subtitles are in English. The first of the traditional arts that I'd like to talk about is archery. And it's got obviously a lot of correlate in the archaeological record of Alabama. There are Choctaw oral stories that talk about how we were given the bow and arrow as a supernatural gift from God. Archaeology tells us that the bow and arrow came into prominence in western Alabama around 750 AD. So at archaeological sites dating after that time period, one of the common artifacts that is found are arrow points. These are some of the arrow points from the Lubbock Creek archaeological site on the Tombigbee River. But with these arrow points, you just see a tiny bit of what's really a pretty complex technology and pretty complex weapon system. So I want to go into some of these other aspects of it that you don't usually see in the archaeological record. So archery is really at least a three-component system. You've got the bow, you've got the arrow, and you've got the quiver. And depending on how you think of it, there are many more components. These are some early Choctaw bows. You can see there are two different types. There are these long bows, which are more powerful. Those are for hunting large game or for war. And then there are these smaller bows that are easier to take through brushy areas. They're for hunting smaller game, or sometimes they're for fishing. Today, most Choctaw people make bows out of bodark or hedge, but in the past, I believe bows were made out of a much broader range of woods. You can see some of those listed here. In order for a wood to be effective for making a bow, it has to have a high lignin content, and it has to have the right cell structure such that when you bend the wood, it snaps back to its original position quickly. That's what creates the spring that makes a bow effective at casting an arrow. I made bows out of a dozen woods or more. I've been making bows since I was a teenager. Actually, archery is what got me interested in our traditional arts and our tribal history. When I was 7 years old, my uncle started teaching me how to chip stone arrowheads and just got fire for learning how to make arrowheads and then arrows and then bows and all of the different things that we're going to talk about today and more. So anyway, these are some of the raw materials for making traditional Choctaw bows. The first step is felling the tree. Usually it's best to fell the tree in the wintertime when the sap is down. Under some circumstances, for some species, you might do it in the summertime. The main tool that was used for felling a tree before European contact was a stone-bladed axe. The style shown here is a celt. That's a type that was used during Mississippian time period at places like Moundville. The celt in itself is a pretty cool construction. It's got a blade that is shaped like a wedge, and that goes into a hole in the handle called a mortise. And it's made so that the handle only touches the two lateral margins of the celt blade. It doesn't touch the two flat sides. If the celt handle were made so that it touched the two flat sides of the celt blade, when you used it, that stone would act like a wedge and it would split the handle apart. Because it only touches the two lateral margins, it doesn't split the handle. It's going cross grain, but every time you swing it into a piece of wood, it makes the fit tighter and tighter. If at some point you want to remove the axe head, you just put a small short piece of wood on the back side and tap it, and it will come out. You can see in the picture there that extra celt blade is by itself. You can use those for splitting wood. People see these tools and they think, oh, that's primitive, but they're really not primitive at all. I've used them quite a bit to cut wood. They're extremely effective. If you're used to using a metal axe and you pick one of these up and use it just like a metal axe, it's not all that effective. But the key is there's a certain threshold. You have to swing it with a certain amount of force. And if you do that, then it's extremely effective at cutting wood. The trees that you see cut down there with these stone axes are bodark. That's one of the very hardest trees in the woods. The picture at the right there, you can see some of the chips of wood that this tool removed, giant chips of wood just as big as what you get with a metal axe. And it's interesting, sometimes as you're cutting these really hard wood with the stone tools, these billows of water vapor come out of the wood. I guess it's compression from the force of the blows. But it is very effective. When you're looking for a tree to make a bow from, you want it to be straight for your branches, kind of like a telephone pole. If possible, you want to find a tree that's from an area where it has grown slowly. That's because it makes the growth rings closer together, and that causes the wood to be stronger. After the wood has been cut, it's time to begin shaping it. Today, when people make bows, usually you cut the wood, you split it, you let it dry out for months to years, and then you shape it. That's the European style of making bows, places like in England with the English longbow. The traditional Native American style caters to using stone tools to shape the wood. And if you're going to use stone tools, then you want to shape the wood, do most of the shaping of the wood while it's still green and soft. So the first step is splitting it. Here that's using a wooden wedge and a stone maul to split this piece of hickory into a bow stave. Next, while the wood's still green, you shave it to take off the larger pieces of material to start to make it into a rough bow shape. In this case, what's pictured there is a stone adze. That's basically like a celt blade that's hafted sideways in a handle. And you use that to begin to chip the wood and pull up a sliver of wood, and then you just pull it off with your hand like you see there. That's a fast, effective way to do the rough shaping of a bow using stone tools. After you take the bow down enough that it's starting to bend a little bit with the blows from the adze, you switch tools. You start to do finer shaping. The first thing is that you flip the stave over and you remove the bark and the inner bark. Depending on the species, you may also remove the sapwood. You do that very carefully with one of two tools. Either you use a broken mussel shell, which is what you see here, and you can see how effective that is at removing scrapings of the green wood, or you use a flint tool. You remove the outer part of the tree's growth areas until you come down to one solid growth ring. You remove the wood so that that one growth ring is exposed through the entire backside of the bow. The backside of the bow is the side of the bow that faces away from you. When you draw the bow, you bend the limb tips towards you. That puts the backside of the bow in tension forces. By leaving one growth ring exposed, it makes the wood stronger in tensional forces. After you've got the back side of the bow done, you flip it over and start to remove wood from what's called the belly side. That's the side that faces you. You remove wood in just the right proportion so that the bow will have an even arc when you bend it, and so that it will have the right amount of force. In this case, what you're going for while the wood is green is to remove enough wood that the bow will bend about 6 inches with 50 pounds of force applied to the handle. When you get to that point, that's about all you can do while the wood's green. So it's thin and wide. That creates a situation where the wood is not going to want to warp laterally, but it will warp up and down, if that makes sense, on the flat sides. So you take that bow stave of green wood and you lash it down to a solid surface like a tree or a split plank or something like that that will not allow it to warp. And you put it in a shaded spot and let it dry for several weeks. While it's doing that, there's a little bit of chance of the ends splitting. So you coat those in melted pine sap like you see in the picture at the right there. And then you just leave the bow, let it cure, let it go from being green wood to dry wood. If you were to do this with a larger piece of wood, it would split, but because it's been thinned down while it's green, it can't split. There's not enough moisture differential between the inside and outside of the wood. So it's strong that way. While the bow stave is drying, you start to make the string. Strings were traditionally made from several different materials. The best ones were made out of tendon, either from the leg of the deer like you see here, it's called Hakshish in the Choctaw language, or from the tendons along both sides of the spine. Tendon, it's the same thing as gristle in your steak. If you've gotten gristle stuck in your teeth from a steak or a roast, that's tendon. That's the same thing that the best bowstrings were made out of. After you remove the tendon from the leg or from the back, you set it aside in a sunny place and dry it out. That's what you see in the picture at the right there. The tendon goes from being white and soft to being amber color, translucent, and very hard. To make a bowstring, after the tendons are dried, you pound them between wood and a rock, and that starts to break up the fibers. Then you strip them, and it'll come apart into these fibers, something like dental floss.
Oh, wow.
To make the string, you take those fibers and soak them in water for a little bit, and then you start to twist and splice them together. So the fibers, if you remove it the right way from a deer leg, the fibers may be 14 inches long or so. But by very carefully splicing them into this 2-ply string, you can make a string however long you want. You even out the splices so there aren't too many splices in one place. That makes the string strong. When you get it as long as you want the string to be, you make it another 8 inches long or so. And then you twist it very carefully, very tightly, and you attach it to 2 fixed points and you let the string dry under tension. As it dries, it will start to slacken up, and then you retwist it, fasten it, and dry it again until the string is completely hard. As I mentioned, there are other materials that you can make bowstrings from. One of the favorites in the past was red squirrel rawhide. You take the hide from a squirrel and clean it, and then you put it in a container of water with a handful of wood ash. The wood ash kills any bacteria so it doesn't smell bad. And then after a few days, the hair will start to slip off. So you slip off all the hair, and then you cut it in a spiral shape like you see on the left there. And from a little bitty squirrel hide, you can make a string as long as you want, depending on how narrow you cut those strips. Usually when you're doing a rawhide string, you make a 2-ply. For a longbow, that would be out of 2 squirrel hides. You twist it together like you see there and dry it under tension, just like you would with a tendon string. Here's another picture of different types of bowstrings, traditional. The one on the top is made from Indian hemp, that's dogbane. That's the strongest type of traditional string, but it's prone to wear. So if you make a bowstring out of that and use it very much, it will wear at the nocks of the bow. It won't last very long. The next string down, that's the 2-ply squirrel rawhide string. Those are very tough, but they're not quite as strong. So they'll be durable, like you're not going to wear it out, but they're not quite as strong as the other strings. So sometimes you have to make them a little bit thicker, which affects the bow performance because it adds more weight. The next picture is of deer gut string, and the bottom picture is of the 2-ply sinew string that you saw being made, the 2-ply tendon string. Generally, that's my favorite. It's got the right combination of strength and durability. While the bow is still drying, you can start to make arrows. There are different types of arrows. These are some early Choctaw war arrows. These happen to be tipped with antler points, and they're fletched with turkey wing feathers. These particular shafts are made out of some kind of hardwood that's been split, a big piece of hardwood that's been split down into splinters and then shaved. These are some other styles of Choctaw arrows for other purposes. On the left, that one has a blunt point. That one's used for hunting birds. It's used for hunting game like a skunk if you don't want to puncture the animal in its scent glands. That arrow is perfect. The next arrows there, those are fishing arrows. You can see they have barbs on them. They don't have fletchings. That one's got a string tied to the back of it that attaches to the bow so you don't lose your arrow. You can actually use the arrow and the string to pull the fish back out of the water. On the right-hand side, that's another style of arrow. Those are just quick practice arrows. They have no fletchings. They have simple rolled metal tips. Those are for field shooting, stump shooting, or those are for small game up close. So we're going to start on the construction of the arrow with the arrow points, which I showed you earlier. These are some from the Choctaw homeland along the Tombigbee River. They're made out of what geologists call Tuscaloosa chert. This is what it looks like. It was common in the sandbars of the river before it was channelized. When the stone comes out of the river, it's a tan, yellowy color, and a lot of times it's pretty hard. So our ancestors and the ancestors of other native folks learned that you can change the properties of the stone by exposing it to heat. The way that I do this is I'll take the nodules of stone and I'll put them in a dry place for a couple of months, just inside the house, to make sure that most of the water is gone from the pores of the stone. If you don't do that, the stone will blow up into little tiny pieces when you heat it. You take the dried stone, and on a day when the wind's pretty calm, when the soil's pretty dry, you can follow this process to heat treat it. And the process is shown in the pictures going from left to right and top to bottom. First, you dig a small pit in the ground. Then you cover the bottom of that pit in hardwood coals. Basically, you build a fire and let it burn down the coals, fall down inside the pit. You cover those hot coals with a layer of dry sand, and it is important that the sand be dry. Then you put the stone in there that you want to heat. The thickest, toughest pieces go at the center. The thinnest, finest pieces go along the edges. You cover that with about 1 inch of sand, and then you've dug the hole at the right depth so that it creates this depression with the sand. That's still a depression that goes down 2 or 3 inches into the ground. Next, you build a fire on top of it, and you keep adding wood until you've got maybe 4 inches of hardwood coals. And then you just let that sit for about 2 days. After 2 days, you come back and scrape off the ash, scrape off the sand, and you've heat treated your stone. At the bottom right there, that's a nodule of Tuscaloosa chert. On the right-hand side, that's a flake that was driven off before it was heat treated. The left side of the stone was heat treated, and then the pieces were put back together. You can see how the heat oxidized the iron in the stone. Basically, it caused it to rust and turn red. That's important culturally, that red color being associated with an arrow. Besides the color change, heating the stone causes these microscopic fractures, microscopic cracks to occur through the grains of the stone, and it makes it so that it chips easier, it's glassier. This is the process of taking one of those heat-treated nodules and making an arrow point out of it using traditional tools, hammer stone, stone abrader, antler billet, antler pressure flaker, and a deer ulna serrating tool, fine pressure flaking tool. The arrows have to go with a shaft. The Choctaw language has 2 different words for arrow. One of them is Naki, which means wooden projectile. The other is Naki, which means cane projectile. So that right there lets you know that Choctaw arrow shafts are made either out of river cane or out of wood. This is a patch of switch cane here, perfect for making arrow shafts. No cane grows completely straight, so you have to hold it over a heat source like the coals that you see there. And as the cane heats up, it'll start to sweat and it gets limber. And then you can straighten out each little crook in it to make it perfectly straight, like you see in the series of pictures here. The process is similar, making a wooden arrow shaft, but first you have to cut the wood and season it, tie it into a bundle, let it sit for a couple of months. Then you take a flint tool and scrape off the outer bark and the inner bark. Then you straighten it like I just described. Then you sand it between 2 pieces of sandstone like you see here. And sometimes you do find these shaft abraders archaeologically. After that, you coat the wooden shaft in grease, and you rub it with a deer antler or a bone. That's called burnishing. It makes the surface very smooth and compact, which helps the arrow to travel better. It's easy to make the nocks to attach an arrow point in cane because the cane's hollow. For wood, it's much more difficult with stone tools. But our ancestors and the ancestors of other native people around the world figured out a really clever way to do it. If you were to cut through a wooden arrow shaft with a stone tool and then physically cut the notch into it, that could easily take all day. It's really tedious to cut cross grain in dry wood with stone tools. But what you can do is pictured there at the left. You take a stone drill and drill it in just a short distance into the wood on opposing faces. Then you take a flake of stone and cut those two notches on either side that you see there. You take a sharp point of stone and scribe from the drilled hole to the notches. And then you bend the wood in a very careful way and it just breaks out that notch like you see there. You can do that in 10 minutes instead of it taking all day to try to saw that out with the stone saw. The picture at the right is attaching an arrow point to a haft that's been made in that way. In this case, that arrow point is shaped entirely with stone tools. It's being attached to the arrow shaft with glue made from rendering down a part of deer that has been put onto deer tendon, and that's being wrapped around it. That makes a very strong attachment. These are different styles of Choctaw traditional arrow points. On the left is a Tuscaloosa Chert point. The next 2 points are made out of deer antler. Those are for hunting large game or for war. The second antler point has a diamond-shaped cross-section, which makes a wound that's very hard to heal, much like a bayonet. The next picture is of a garfish scale point wrapped on with a segment of bird quill. That's for hunting small game. The next point with the barbs is a fishing arrow, and that's attached with plant fiber string, and it's coated in pine pitch, which makes that waterproof. The next image is sharpened river cane. That's used for hunting small game. The next image is a blunt point, like I was talking about earlier, for hunting birds. The next one is a copper point made with stone tools. And the last one is just a rolled 10 point like those field arrows I was showing you earlier. Fletching involves attaching feathers to the back end of the arrow. Those provide drag that help keep the arrow from tumbling in the air. And the curvature of the feathers also makes the arrow spin like a rifle bullet. With turkey feathers are the best type of fletching material because they're the toughest. You can strip them like you see on the left there, or you can very carefully cut and shave them with a piece of flint. These are some finished arrows of different styles that we just talked about. In making the arrow, it's more complicated than it sounds. So much like with a bow, you have to remove just the right material so that its stiffness matches the strength of the bow. If the arrow is too stiff, or if the arrow is not stiff enough for the bow, it won't fly straight. It'll go to the left or to the right. So whether it's cane or hardwood, you have to instruct. This is a quiver of traditional made into buckskin like this. By this point, the wood should have dried for the bow. It should be several weeks down the road. So now you finish the bow. You do the fine shaping with flakes of stone. Now the wood's hard enough that a mussel shell won't carve it. You shape it with stone and you take off wood in just exactly the right proportions so that the bow bends in an even arc. Like you see there, that bow being drawn back. Not only that, it has to be done in just the right portions.
Dr. Thompson, you still there? There we go. Still there, Dr. Thompson?
Hello?
Oh, we got you back.
Okay.
Broken up for a second.
Okay.
But you were just talking about the bow and taking off some of the fine chipped portions.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where we stopped or we broke up.
Okay. So I was saying you want to take off just exactly the right amount of wood. There's an arc to it such that the bow will bend evenly. such that it will bend with the right amount of force at the right drawing. So a lot of our old bows were 70 pounds or more draw. It had the wood removed in just such a way that when you pulled an arrow back 28 to 30 inches, it would take 70 pounds of force to do that. So it's a real art. Do you want me to move back to full screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. And of course, the bow has to be tuned, like I said, with the arrows, and it has to be tuned with the bowstring. So it's a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface, and a lot more complicated than you would know just from looking at arrow points found archaeologically.
Yeah, I think I learned a lot just now, like especially with the different types of like the with the curing the bow and all that kind of stuff, and how, like you said, it takes about a couple weeks just for the bow. Like how long would it take from taking it from the wood to completion?
Well, if you do it with the techniques I've just described, working greenwood with stone tools, it takes about 2 weeks.
Okay. Cool.
This is the way that arrows, the Choctaw tribe fired arrows traditionally. You know, today we're taught the Mediterranean release in school like this, but this is the Choctaw style. And it creates a powerful weapon, you know, all the way from fishing bows that are made for shooting close range to bows that can shoot a war arrow a couple hundred yards. When the DeSoto folks came into the Choctaw area and to the Southeast in general, there are accounts of Native people being able to shoot an arrow almost completely through the length of a horse. So we're talking shooting an arrow through 6 feet of horse flesh. And a modern rifle bullet can't do that. But this is something that folks would have done, men would have done from the time they were 2 or 3 or 4 years old. You know, until they passed away, they would have been making bows and trying to perfect the technological aspects of them. Today, bows are still important to the tribe. These are Choctaw youth learning how to chip stone arrow points. Our tribe has a seal. It appears on our flag in different areas, and it's got a bow on it. And here, 2 years ago, we replaced the image of the bow on that flag, which was an English longbow, with a Choctaw bow. So now that matches our older seal. The Choctaw bow was replaced with an English bow back in the 40s. So we've got it back to a Choctaw bow now, in part because of this revitalization work we're doing. So that's the first traditional art. I'll go through the 2 others a little bit more quickly, but do you guys have any questions to this point about traditional bows, arrows, arrow points, quivers?
Let's see, let me check the comments. It looks like there's a lot of people saying hello. I don't have any questions. I don't think they have any questions yet in the comments, but okay. I think it's really fascinating. And it seems like it's a lot of meticulous work, and you have to know like to do just like the right things at the right times. It seems like absolutely, it's a skill.
Definitely, it's an art that's been perfected for 100 years. And there are other things too I didn't go into, like there are ways to heat treat the wood so that it's not as affected by moisture, and there are ways to seal it with different types of plant saps with different colors so you can make the bow any color you want to. There's a lot to it. But in interest of time, I'm going to go ahead to the next traditional art, which is Tasvnnuk, traditional hide tanning. This is an art that's been perfected for more than 10,000 years. Basically, it takes a cold, slimy, bad-smelling hide and turns it into this warm, beautiful, great-smelling material called buckskin. You can do traditional hide tanning with almost any animal in the Choctaw homeland, except, you know, if you're doing fish or alligators, it's a little bit different process. The material that we used the most was the white-tailed deer, of course. It begins with skinning, and skinning is an art form. Today, a lot of people cut the hides off with a knife, and they do it in such a way that it makes an outline of the hide like an hourglass shape. The way to do it traditionally is you just use one flake of chert, make the incisions in the appropriate places, and then you peel it off. And you make the incisions in such a way that it creates the shape that you see to the right there. Other than the legs sticking out, that's a nice rectangular shape, which is perfect for making clothing. The way that most hunters today skin a deer is they make the incisions like you would on a dissection frog, and it creates an hourglass shape that's really not very usable in the hide. The hide's made up of these different layers that you see here, the membrane, the grain, and the fiber network. In order to tan the hide, you have to remove the membrane and the grain, and there are two main ways that was done traditionally. What most people think of is the dry scraping process. To do that, you lace a green hide, soft hide, into a wooden frame. You clean off the meat if there's any, then you let it dry, and you scrape it with a stone scraper. This is, people find what they think are scrapers archaeologically all the time. They think they're hide scrapers. But in order for a piece of stone to be effective at scraping a hide, it has to have an extremely smooth but sharp edge. So you see the scraper at the right there. That's a much smoother edge than what you usually find archaeologically, pieces that are labeled scrapers. But that edge there was used to scrape the hide that you see in the middle picture. And you see those scores in the hide just from that smooth edge. You put those scores in there. Most things that are found archaeologically that people say are scrapers, their edges are so rough, if you actually use that, it would cut the hide to shreds. So something to be aware of. This is a more common technique that was used for removing the hair and the grain layer of a hide. This is the technique my great-grandfather used. You take the green hide and you scrape off the meat and the fat if there's any. Again, if you skin it right, there shouldn't be any. It should all be left on the animal. And then you make a paste out of hardwood ash and you coat both sides of the hide with it. Then you roll it up and put it in a hole in the ground and leave it for about 3 days, depending on the temperature. The wood ash has an alkali solution. It will kill any bacteria that's in the hide. It will kill Lyme disease if it's in the hide. And it also destroys the hide's mucous membrane. That's what keeps the hide waterproof during an animal's life. By destroying it chemically, it makes it so that later in the tanning process, the tanning solution will absorb into the hide and it will make the hide much, much easier to tan than without doing the wood ash. The wood ash also causes the hide to swell up, so it's a lot easier to scrape off the hair, the epidermis, and the grain layer. These are traditional tools for doing that. Just a deer radius and ulna combination, just like it comes out of the animal, is perfect. It's about the best tool you can have. You can also make the tool out of a cannon bone by cutting a little notch out of it, like you see in the picture there. After the hide is fully scraped, you have to neutralize the wood ash. So you go to a moving stream and weight the hide down and just let the water wash over it for 24 hours. Then the pH is back to neutral so that you can tan it. That's what a rawhide looks like. This is a spot where it can be stored. You can take the hide and dry it out and roll it up and put it in your lodge up in the rafters where the smoke gets to it, or you can go ahead and tan it from this point. Hides were traditionally tanned by our tribe using a dressing solution made either from brains or from egg yolks. They both have emulsified oils that will penetrate the hide, lubricate its fibers, and keep those from sticking together as the hide dries. In other words, it prevents the hide from becoming like a board, like rawhide. In order for this action to happen, you have to dry the hide under just the right circumstances. First, you wring it out, which stretches the fibers. And then as you dry it, you have to keep the fibers stretching back and forth to prevent those cross linkages from happening, to allow the emulsified oils to keep the hide soft. There are different ways to do that. One traditional way is to lash it into a frame and use this tool that's almost like a narrow canoe paddle and just push it against the hide, constantly stretching it until the hide's fully dry. Another technique is to use that canoe paddle tool, bury it in the ground, and then pull the hide back and forth over it like this. If you do it right, the hide comes out soft. It's like fleece, like the inside of a sweatshirt. If you mess up any part of it, any part of the hide dries stiff, you immediately put it back in the tanning solution and do it again. So it may take 8 hours to get the hide completely dry. If you mess it up, you have to redo it. That's another 8 hours. So you want everything to be just right chemically with the wood ash, with the neutralizing, with the tanning solution, so that you only have to do this once per hide. The different scraping treatments create buckskin with different surfaces. On the left there, that's buckskin from a hide that was processed with a scraping tool made out of Tuscaloosa chert. Even with its smooth edge, it puts those scores in the hide. The hide in the middle there was scraped with a stone tool, but then it was sanded with a piece of sandstone. It takes out some of those scores. The hide on the right was scraped with the deer bones, and you can see how it has a smoother, finer grained texture. hides in that state are very vulnerable. If they get wet, you either have to re-soften them as they're drying, or they will dry stiff like rawhide. They're also a favorite snack for certain types of bugs like domestic beetles and for dogs. To prevent that, our ancestors and other people around the world learned that you can expose the hide to smoke. The smoke has creosote in it that preserves the hide. It also creates chemical bridges between the fibers in the hide that will physically not allow them to join together again. In other words, even if the hide gets wet, it won't dry stiff. To do this, you dig a hole in the ground and fill it with coals from hardwood, and then you put smoking material in it. One of the common things that was used was dry corn cobs, but you can use dozens, probably hundreds of different smoking materials, and they'll give the hide different colors and different characteristics. This is one way that a hide was smoked traditionally. You got your smudge pit, and then you take willow saplings, stick them in the ground and bend them over, almost like the poles of a modern tent. And then you peg down the edges of the hide. The idea is to make that almost airtight. For smoke to be produced, the fire has to be right at the point where it's going to flame, but not quite. If it flames, it will destroy the hide. So you have to very carefully cut off the oxygen to just the right point that it's almost flaming, but not quite. And then you have to watch it. You smoke both sides of the hide, and it'll be protected from moisture and insects. As I said, different smoking materials give the hide different colors. In the past, they did different things where they would paint sizing on the hide before it was smoked, and that gives it negative design patterns, which are really cool. You can also do paints and dyes on top of the hide. This hide here, the background is bodark wood shaving dye, and then in the foreground, those paint colors come from charcoal, from limestone chalk, and from hematite mixed with hide glue. You can also take a smoked hide and change it further chemically by exposing it to a tannic acid solution. This is a tannic acid solution made out of walnut hulls, but there are lots of other things you can use. Those will dye a hide a different color, and they create additional linkages with the fibers that make it so that it absorbs less water. So it's perfect for footwear, for example. So this is kind of a finished product combining the archery and the hide tanning. This is a bow, hickory bow, sinew string, cane and wood arrow shafts, and a quiver. And they're all made completely from materials that I've showed you, using stone and bone tools that come from the Tombigbee River Valley. Even the color of the quiver, that's some limonite that came from the Tombigbee Valley that was burned to oxidize it to make it red, and then ground up into a paint and used on to color a hide that had been smoked with the corn cobs. So that's the second traditional art. Do we have any questions at this point?
Just one for me. I know you mentioned like some of the tannic acid solutions, the walnut. What's another example of a solution?
One that I use the most is dried sweet gum leaves.
Okay.
They make a lighter dye solution. It's not as noticeable, but it still has the effect of making the leather so that it's less water absorbent. A sumac was another common one, but there are many things that you can use. Lots of plant materials have tannic acid in them.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this is an art form that continues in our community a little bit. I started tanning hides when I was a teenager. I've brain tanned about 130 hides, everything from squirrel to bison, but mostly deer. This is a hide tanning class that I was able to teach for Choctaw Nation last year. And we took these hides that were tanned, and they were used to make garments to go on the mannequins in our cultural center, which will be opening shortly. So the cultural center and the exhibits for it have been a way to help spread knowledge about our traditional arts in the community and to work to revitalize some of them. The last traditional art that I'm going to talk about in the time that we have is pottery. The Choctaw name for that is Atoba, short for Atoba. Things that are made out of clay, things that are made out of dirt is what it means. The picture here, those are two traditional vessel forms from a couple thousand years ago, the style. The one in the back has lamb's quarter seeds. The one in the front has stew that's made out of lamb's quarter and meat and hickory nuts. Was one of the national dishes, one of the most common dishes in the eastern and southeastern United States up until the advent of corn agriculture. This, of course, wouldn't be very possible without pottery to cook it in. Pottery goes back in the Choctaw homeland approximately 3,500 years. It's about 100 generations. According to our oral stories, it was first conceived of when a man had a river cane basket and he wanted to use it to hold liquid. So he took the basket, and it seemed to him like maybe if he coated it with clay on the inside and let it dry, that would hold moisture. So he coated the basket with clay and set it near a fire to dry. And another person came along and they saw that basket with the clay in it and they said, well, that basket's dirty. I'm just going to put it in this fire and burn it up, which is what they did. But of course, when the cane burned, it created heat, and that caused the clay to change chemically, and it made a hard stone-like vessel. And at least according to our oral traditions, that's how pottery was first developed in our homeland. Pottery, like the other traditional arts I've talked about, is not an easy process. When I was a kid, I used to dabble in the art. I would go dig clay. I would make pots. I'd dry them out. I'd fire them in a pit fire in my parents' backyard. And they'd always blow up because I didn't know what I was doing. I stuck with it periodically. Growing up when I was a teenager, early 20s, I had a few pieces that survived, but it still wasn't easy. What you see here are the pots that I broke while I was trying to learn how to make shell temper pottery on my own. It represents over 300 hours of making pottery and firing it. And it turned out I had two main problems. One was not all of my clays were the best, but also when you're making shell temper pottery, firing it, you have to hit a temperature window between 1,000 and 1,250 degrees Fahrenheit. And the only way to do that is using your senses, your eyes, your hands, your skin, to tell the temperature of the fire. So that's what my problem was. It is not easy when you're learning, unless you have somebody to teach you. Eventually, Tammy Bean shared knowledge with me that let me learn how to do it, and I've done hundreds and hundreds of fires since then. In the traditional Choctaw way of thinking, the earth is sacred. It's where the bodies of all people and plants and animals come from. In the Choctaw language, clay is called Lokfi Nia, and that means the fat of the earth. There are different tests that you can go through to see if clay will be suitable for making pottery. Basically, the first test is to see if it's malleable enough to make any shape that you might want without it cracking. That's an easy enough test. You just get the clay, mix it with some water, and see how malleable it is. One test is to roll it out like a snake and see if it will tie in a knot without breaking. If it will do that, then it's workable enough to make whatever shape of pottery you want. The second test is to tell if that particular clay has the right minerals in it to harden in the firing atmosphere. And you can do expensive chemical tests, but the easiest way to do it is just to take a little bit of the clay, mix it with an aplastic material like sand, make a small pottery vessel out of it, dry it, and fire it and see what happens. If that vessel blows into 1,000,000 pieces, that lets you know that clay's got some mineral in it, like iron pyrite, that's not stable in the firing atmosphere, and you want to look for a different clay. If that miniature test pot survives, then that lets you know, well, maybe that's a good clay and it would be worth the effort of digging more and trying some larger pieces out of it. If you've ever seen a mud puddle in the summertime, as it starts to dry out, the surface cracks. Our ancestors and other people around the world learned that if you mix certain materials with the clay, it will help keep it from cracking. You see a list of the materials that were used in our homeland here and the different dates. My personal favorite one is mussel shell. To process mussel shell into a pottery temper, you take the shells and you have to heat them to between 1,000 and 1,250 degrees. Usually this translates to a layer of hardwood coals about 3 inches deep. So you build that layer of coals and then just put the shells on them. And the chemical change happens within just a few minutes. They'll start to change color and get flaky. You just fish them out of the fire. And then to use them for pottery, you grind them up into different coarsenesses depending on the style of pottery that you want to make and mix them in with the clay. Different types of clay require different amounts of temper. For cooking vessels in particular, they tended to choose clays that were really sticky so they could take lots and lots of shell. Some of the old Choctaw cooking pots are more shell than clay. And that's smart because the aplastic material, the shell, the more that you can add in, the more it helps keep the pots from warping during drying, firing, and use. And also, it adds a material of a different density. So if a crack starts to form in the clay, it'll hit that shell, which is a different density, and it will tend to stop the crack. Choctaw pottery, traditional pottery from the southeast that's intended for cooking pots. The particles of shell are large, and there's a lot of it. That makes it strong against the stresses of thermal expansion, cooking, heating and cooling repeatedly. The pottery that's used for serving or eating, the temper tends to be ground a lot smaller, and sometimes there's less of it. that helps make the pottery stronger against mechanical shock, you know, being dropped accidentally. But it wouldn't be very strong if you chose to cook in it. These are the most common traditional building techniques from the Southeast. On the left-hand side, that's a mold technique. You take the tempered clay and push it into a hemispheric clay bowl. That's an old technique. I've seen those mold marks on pottery that dates back at least 1,500 years. Of course, coiling was really common in the Southeast. So paddling was common, especially on the cooking pots. You stick the coils together very firmly, mash them with your hands, and then you paddle the pot like you see at the right there. It's almost like blacksmithing it. That helps to compress the walls of the pot, get them an even thickness, and it also helps to align the shell particles so that they're in line with the walls, which makes it stronger. Serving vessels were often burnished. You get the surface of the vessel as smooth as you can. A lot of times you rub it with slip on a piece of buckskin, and then you go back while it's still moist and rub it with a smooth stone. The stone that you see there is river gravel from the Tombigbee River. It's being used to burnish a bottle that's made from shell-tempered clay from the Tombigbee River. After a couple weeks, it's time to fire the pottery. After a couple weeks of drying, you pick a calm day. And the way that I do this is a technique that I learned from Tammy Bean. You go out on a calm day, you turn the ground over like a garden, down about 6 inches deep. You build a fire of hardwood coals on top of that turned over ground. You churn those coals into the ground and build another fire on top, and you just keep repeating that process until the soil is completely dry and powdery. Then you scoop the hot coals off to the side, making a ring of coals around a central area of hot ground. You take broken pieces of fired pottery and you put them on top of the hot ground. You let them get up above the boiling point to let any moisture escape from them, and then you let it cool down until it's about 150 degrees or so. You set the pots that you want to fire on top of that, and then you start to build up that ring of coals. You start to take little bits of coal and drop them at the center of the pots in between, and slowly you heat that up. The clay will let you know what temperature it is by the color that the clay is, and eventually, slowly, you build that fire up until it engulfs the pots. And if it's shell temper, again, you have to hit a window between 1,000 and 1,250 degrees. If you pay attention carefully to the clay, it will let you know what that temperature is. If you're doing sand temper or something like that, then you want to heat the pots up hotter. The firing atmosphere and the minerals in the clay determine what color it comes out. A lot of the old pottery, especially serving vessels, is smudged black. To do that, you take the pots out of the fire while they're still pretty hot, and you put them in a pile of organic material. Like in this case, these are dry pine needles. And you allow it to smoke but not flame. While the pot's still hot, its particles are expanded, which means the space between the particles is larger. And that will allow the smoke to go inside there. And then when it cools, it traps those particles and it makes it black. This is that technique used to make a reproduction of a Moundville bottle. The pot's been formed, it's been burnished, it's been fired, it's been smudged, and then the designs are scratched into it, like you see there. That's Sinti Lapita, the horned serpent from Choctaw mythology. This is a traditional cooking pot of a style that was made about 500 years ago, just cooking right on the coals. Some other styles of cooking pots, like the ones that were made at Moundville in particular, were made to hang over the fire. That's much more efficient at heat transfer than just sitting on the coals like this. A lot of times we don't think about it, but pottery was also used. This is a traditional bread oven. You take wet clay, put it on the ground, build a fire on top of it, dry it out so it gets hard, scoop the coals away, put a loaf of bread on top of it. In this case, this one's made from traditional cornmeal mixed with lotus seeds to make it sweet. You put a coarsely shell-tempered bowl over it like this, then you pack the coals around it just like a Dutch oven, and it cooks just like a Dutch oven.
That's cool.
And then, of course, we've got the serving bowls. This one's made out of Tombigbee River clay. That is Walakshi inside it. It's a cornmeal and blackberry dish, traditional dish, kind of like a cobbler. And then this is the original Choctaw fry bread. This is traditional ground cornmeal fried in bear grease, and that's in a flaring rim bowl there in a style from the Tombigbee River, and it's made from Tombigbee River clay. And we've done lots and lots of work to revitalize Choctaw traditional pottery over the last decade. We've taught hundreds of classes, given demonstrations to tens of thousands of people. And now we have several tribal artists that have really taken an interest in pottery, and they're revitalizing the art and they're becoming teachers. So that's where that art form stands now. By my clock, we've got just a few minutes left. Does the group have any questions for me?
Let's see. I'll keep looking in our comments to see if anybody has any questions. Or even if Rebecca in the background has any questions, because she typically has questions too. Let's see. There was one question that says, I guess you kind of answered it with your talking about oral traditions, but how do we know how these techniques were figured out? Was it a lot of trial and error to figure out how the things worked? A lot of the art forms. How did you, how were the techniques figured out?
Well, in a lot of cases, Choctaw oral tradition says that these things were given to us as a supernatural gift by God at different points in our history.
Mm-hmm.
But in addition to that, you know, people who lived in the past were just as intelligent as we are today. You know, their lifestyle made it so that they were encouraged to be very observant of their surroundings, and they had lots of time. So it shouldn't be a surprise that they came up with these really complex, advanced ways of doing things, because they were our intellectual equivalents in the past.
Awesome. Any more questions? Well, all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Thompson, I've learned a lot, and I appreciate you sharing this art with us today. And I think that's going to do it for this Museums from Your Home live stream. If you're enjoying Museums from Your Home and would like to support, thank you for coming. If you're enjoying Museums from Your Home and would like to support us, please consider becoming a member of the UA Museums at give.ua.edu/museums. And you'll never miss a live stream or video content by subscribing to UA Museums on YouTube at youtube.com/UA Museums. Also, don't forget to visit the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma on their Facebook page. And thanks to everyone who is watched with us live and to all those who will watch with us later for visiting UA Museums from your home. I'll see you guys next week.